Hello and welcome to the Dark Side. I'm your host, Tabitha Purple, and my co-host today is Mr. Storm. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm always great.
Yes, you are. So today we are back in our usual hot seats and we are looking at some questions of the day. Today's question that we will be looking at is, can Black people be racist? So that's our topic today. It's going to be a bit fiery, I think. It's a question that I often get asked by people when we're doing trainings and just in general life. Yes, but are Black people racist, or haven't you experienced Black people being racist? And so I think the topic will be a good education for us all. But today we're going to start our story with some news. Have you got a news story for us, Mr. Storm?
I'll let you go first.
Okay. I was just trying to discreetly change the whatchamacallit on this. So I'm going to do it not so discreetly. Bless you. I need to change the status, live, edit privacy, make it public so I can see your comments. If you put comments in the comment section, we will now be able to see them. Thank you very much. All right, so my news story for today is a report from out of the UK. It is a report that is called the I Can't Breathe, Race, Death and British Policing. It's an independent inquest that was heard after a charity that helps bereaved families. After contact with police, they ordered an inquiry. And so this inquiry has found that which the government has hidden. So up until 2021, the government claimed that there was no evidence that Black people were dying at a higher rate than white people after contact with police. So despite a huge number of high-profile stories, the denial has always been, and there are a number of reports that have come out, but even in 2021, just a couple of years ago, we had this kind of denial that there was any disparity whatsoever. White people die, Black people die is what it is. Very disturbing attitude to have, but there you go. However, this inquest has found that the government have never released the total deaths following restraints, have never been made public. The report said neither had the actual figures for racial disproportionality has never been released. And so the idea that they have been saying this lie so frequently is actually quite disturbing, because the truth of the matter is the official data that is covered by deaths in custody actually says that you are 7 times more likely to die in custody if you are Black than if you're white. Okay, so when you look at the statistics, when you look at the raw data, what you will see is, of course, more white people die in custody than Black people. That is because white people make up a higher percentage of the population. However, when we look at those statistics and actually then evaluate them, what you then find is that the Black population is disproportionately high, considering how much of the population they make up, and disproportionately high as compared to white people. So why would the Black people die 7 times more likely to die? So this is one of those cases where a report has been written, and this is going to take a while, I think, to unpack and filter down, but it was just literally released within the last few days. And so these are the first articles that are coming out. One of the things that the article covers is one of these sorts of grey areas, because what it says is that there are official data for those in custody. But maybe you will remember the case of Darlian Atkinson. Do you remember that case of the footballer?
Yeah.
Yep. The footballer that was killed in 2016. Technically, he wasn't in custody. He was killed by police. So an armed officer fired an electric stun gun into him for 33 seconds, kicked him twice in the head while he was on the ground with so much force that it actually left the imprint of his laces in the forehead of Atkinson as he lay there dying. Atkinson was never arrested, technically under arrest. So this is technically not a custody issue. Death in custody is a separate thing. And so what they've been doing is they have been hiding, inflating the other category, people who've come into contact with police and have died. That category has been overly inflated, shall we say. And therefore, these questions are actually coming up. And so, of course, there has been responses from the Home Office. It says that the Home Office has not actually. Has there been a statement from the Home Office yet? No, the statement has come from the National Black Police Association, and they said the figures were shocking. Andy George is the president of that association, said the figures were shocking and that he feared that stereotyping was a factor. No kidding, Sherlock, you're not really saying much. The fact that Black people are more likely, and this is a quote, the fact that Black people are much more likely to die whilst being restrained is further evidence that policing is still failing to protect Black people. The lack of diverse workforce means officers and staff are less likely to have personal connections to Black communities, which lead them to having a biased view of the people they come into contact with. This can impact decision-making, with officers more likely to view Black people as bigger, stronger, and more dangerous due to their lack of exposure to Black communities. The data goes on, and then the IOPC are heavily criticised, and we have talked about the IOPC here quite a lot here on the dark side, but the IOPC are heavily criticised in this report for ignoring the extent of racial disproportionality in deaths in their own official data and failing to publish the stark figures. So the IOC have released a statement, and it says evidence of disproportionality in the use of police powers has long been a concern, which impacts the confidence of policing, particularly in Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. That's why we launched a program in 2020 to explore, challenge, and address issues of race discrimination in policing in order to drive real change in police policies and practice. This report goes to show that I think one of the sad things about a report like this is that people will find ways of discrediting the report rather than saying, okay, this is a problem. How can we seriously address the issues that disproportionately affect communities? And I think while we're talking about that, we have covered a number of cases in the UK of stories throughout the UK of Black people who have been either in a mental health crisis or have been taken into custody or have not been taken into custody and have died due to heavy-handed policing. And none of these involve guns. They normally involve tasers and violence and physically abhorrent violence of kicking someone to death, basically, or kneeling on them and crushing them until they die. And instead of saying maybe the way that we police human beings is not right because everyone is dying, what people will seek to do is say, can't be that bad. And I think that's what disturbs me, is that, you know, they had to, an independent charity who works with bereaved families who have come to the conclusion through their work, hang on, we're seeing a disproportionately high number of people of color through the services of the police. How is this possible when you're telling us that you're not killing them at a higher rate? There's a problem with what we are dealing with on the ground compared to what you are saying publicly, and called for an inquest. And in that inquest, we have this report. And I think, you know, people are going to play politics. There's going to be blame games. It's not this government, it's not that government, when the reality is it's a systemic issue. And until you deal with the systems, you're going to constantly be in this loop. So that's my news story for this week. It's not the most uplifting news story, but it is what it is. Any thoughts on the news story?
Look, I think it goes beyond disbelief. The idea that some of the institutions that have so far responded claiming that they did not know or that it was shocking. I am not a researcher, professional researcher.
Not professionally, of course. You don't get paid for it, but you do that
No.
here on the dark side. You are a researcher.
I don't get paid. for it, right? So I don't
You are
spend,
always so-
but my point is, it's not my occupation. It's not what I spend all my time doing. I don't have access to all the raw data, right, that these institutions would have.
Mm.
And yet I can tell you without this report, all the problems that the report is telling you,
Mhm, mhm,
so it goes beyond disbelief for people to claim ignorance in this day and age. And I think the IOPC is it's not worth the charter. It's not worth the paper that the charter is printed on. Because essentially you have the police, because it's ex-police investigating the police, right? Their claim that they launched some program to investigate, that's simply code for, we are going to do whatever we can to continue the conversation without actually implementing real practical changes.
mhm.
And things like this you will see repeatedly just go, we're going to do a report, we're going to commission a report, we're going to set up an investigatory panel, we're going to, and all you'll do is talk, but you won't actually implement changes. So for me, I'm just like, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of all the talking when people actually know what needs to be done. Um, as for the Black Police Association, how can I put this? I'm trying to think of the most polite, diplomatic way I can put this. I don't give a F what you say. Y'all are essentially the black overseer on the slave plantations, right? Y'all know what's going on behind the scenes. Do you know how I know this? Because I've heard black police officers complain to me about what's going on behind the scenes. But you complain to me privately, but you're not doing anything publicly. You're complicit in the crimes. You're complicit in the problem, right? So yeah, I don't care. I don't care what they're gonna say.
Okay. That's not my take on the Black IOPC, but good. Excellence. We have a difference of opinion there. But we'll continue on with this. Let's see what your news story is today before we get to our main topic.
Well, here's the thing. If you thought I was bad the last show we did with the 2-in-1, I think I can manage to get 3 into 1.
All right, people, hold on to your seats. Here goes. Let's do it.
Right. So I was torn between a couple of stories. And actually, there's links you can make between them because it's a whole bunch of hypocrisy going on. So the US has come out and they have said that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in its wars with Ukraine.
Okay.
And you know what? In fact,
You're
no,
right.
there's not even probably. I am sure that is 100% true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the US have gone on to say that China might be about to aid Russia by providing them with ammunition and other weapons.
Okay.
Okay. So that's 2 news stories. Okay. Now, I find it pretty rich that the US, who has not signed up to the International Courts of Justice, is going to accuse another country of having committed war crimes when there are no avenues available to prosecute your citizens and your armies who are known to have committed war crimes. Right? But more importantly, or I think more pertinently, is actually the word I want here. The claim that that China is about to supply Russia with weapons. When you are currently supplying Israel with weapons, have equipped Israel with nuclear weapons, despite them being in contravention of numerous UN resolutions, despite Israel being labeled by the Human Rights Watch, one of the leading, if not the leading, human rights organization globally, as being an apartheid state. So Israel itself is committing crimes. You are supplying them with weapons, and this is where we have the link to the third story, because Israel is committing crimes against humanity, and just today they launched an attack on a civilian population in Syria, killing at least 15 people. Now, I just want to remind people that Syria has just suffered devastating earthquakes. And whilst people in Syria are trying to deal with the tragedy of this, Israel takes this moment to bomb them. And the US has remained silent. It does not regard it as a crime against humanity to target civilian areas when Israel does it. And yet when Russia does it, it is. So the hypocrisy. 3 stories in one. There you go.
Well done. I'm impressed. As always, the hypocrisy is real, and so that you've managed to find the 3 stories that link that in the news. I concur. I think it's really disturbing. And I think what I would like people to understand is that we're not saying you shouldn't call out Russia for those atrocities. What we are saying is that it should be equally applied across the board. And I think that's always the question when, people have this real whataboutism, we call it, when you say, well, hey, you're calling out Russia, but you're not doing this. And they're like, well, look at this. And you're like, or what we could do is we could call Russia out and we could call them out, and you can agree to sign up to the human courts, and you can deal with your issues with China. It's not an either or. There's not a competition here for how much grief and suffering we can pass out. We can actually just support people who are in need. And yes, the last story is very disturbing. So thank you for bringing us that issue. Let's get to our main topic of the day. As I said, this is a question I have been asked earnestly and frequently by viewers of the show, by other people we have done training for, by people I know who know that we do this kind of anti-racist work and so on and so forth. A question I get asked frequently is, but can Black people be racist? And so I thought we'd do a complete show, because there were a number of stories that had come about over the course of Black History Month that had led to the question of, can Black people be racist? And it was quite interesting to see how they were being promoted, how things were being put forward. But I had like a thought that we need to really kind of unpack what then does it mean to be racist? and maybe help our viewers to understand and wrestle with this issue of what is racism versus what is prejudice, what is xenophobia, some of these other things that you can have that are about prejudice, essentially, but also looking at white supremacist systems and how they maybe affect everyone. So I don't know from what angle Mr. Storm wants to tackle this evening, but it's certainly a question that leaves me sometimes slightly frustrated. And I have changed my answer. So let me say this. When I would originally get asked this as a trainer, as an educator, as a person who is just out here fighting for justice for people, I would often say the answer to that question is no. And I would say that based on the idea that what we're often talking about is racism within European or European-led countries. So your big major European countries, plus places like the USA and places like Australia, New Zealand, those sorts of places. We're talking about places which are European peoples-led, otherwise defined as white people. And because we're talking about racism within those contexts, the idea that there's reverse racism or that Black people can be racist, I would often answer that question with no, don't be ridiculous, because what power does a Black person have to influence the course of people's lives? None. If one Black person who is, let's say, hiring, which is always the go-to, well, if a Black person is hiring and they only choose to hire Black people, aren't they being racist against white people? No, you just go to all the companies that are hiring white people, because most of them do. This one company is empowering their own people because they find it difficult to get jobs in all those other companies, and therefore it's a problem. I mean, we could talk about that in the context of someone like, his name's just gone out of my head. Peele, Jordan, who did the Get Out movie.
Yeah, Jordan
Peele, who was asked a very similar question. And the reason for the question was that he has said quite publicly he's making Black films for Black people. That's what he's doing. And he's not looking to cast lead characters as white people. And the media were up in arms. And his response was, yo, every day there are films for you. These films are specifically being created for people who are not represented. And then people had the great nerve to point out that he was married to someone who was perceived as white, and thereby what gave him a right to act like that and question his credentials based on that. And so it really led me to really say, I think it's a question we need to examine and ask ourselves, not from a perspective of we want to have you in the dirt with us, because the question is normally phrased from a white lens and a white perspective. But really, we need to kind of look at these terms and say, well, what's going on here? And why do people ask the question? What are they hoping there's going to come out of it? And as I said, my answer to the question has actually changed drastically, particularly in the last 3 years. The more work I've done in the field, the more work I've done in education, the more work I've done at research, as we talk about, the more my answer goes to yes, but not for the reason that most people would suspect. Not because there is something called reverse racism or that Black people are being racist towards white people, but actually, if we are embedded in a white supremacist system, then the racism that is built within that affects everyone. And you can be as damaging about yourself and those from your own race, which we know to be a social construct. We can be damaging about ourselves as much as the other can damage us. And it feeds into an entire system that means that everybody is participating and taking part in a white supremacist system, and it's affecting all areas of life. So I've changed my answer, but maybe not in the way that most people would want me to answer it. I don't know. So anyway, Mr. Storm, can Black people be racist?
Yes, for the reasons you gave. Yes, for other reasons. And overall, no.
Okay. All right, let's get into
So
it.
we're going to deal with, philosophical concepts. I'm not working with the the duality of Greek philosophy,
Okay.
which is
Hmm.
either or. It's
Hmm.
more and. Um,
So more of a Jewish concept. It's this and that.
yes. And I think when we look at the definition of racism, it's the concept of um, being able to unfairly or negatively impact another racial group, having the power to do that.
So
And I
prejudice
think,
plus power.
yes, and I think that is possible. So if you take, for example, um, let's take Bermuda, for example.
Okay.
Okay. Um, mm, they wanted to pass laws, the majority black population, and they wanted to pass laws that essentially would have kept foreigners out, especially from higher paying jobs.
Hmm.
And the foreigners that were coming in at the time mostly were white,
Hmm.
and they were taking the higher earning jobs away from Bermudians who
Locals.
were black. And so you see, even within that, with the people who are coming in, there's prejudice. But who ultimately holds the voting power was the black population. So they decided, look, we're going to right this injustice. Um, But it could be argued, actually, you're not operating a meritocracy now.
Mm.
Not that you were before, but even so, you've gone from trying to correct the injustice to establish a meritocracy to
Hmm.
now giving the advantage to a particular group of people.
Okay.
Okay. The problem with that is you can argue that. So, yes, you have the ability to do that. The problem is that globally, we operate within a system of white supremacy, and the
Mm.
system will always take steps to correct itself. And by that, I mean a lot of the international companies that operate in Bermuda,
Hmm.
white owned,
Hmm.
white led, white CEOs,
Hmm.
white heads of HR kicked up a fuss. And
Hmm.
because you ultimately hold the economic wealth,
Hmm.
you're able to correct the system to continue to perpetuate the systems of imbalance and racial
Injustice.
prejudice.
Hmm.
Okay, so ultimately, nothing changes. So you have that small microcosm where actually you can argue, yes, black people can be racist, but the long term effect is that the system will always work to correct itself.
And I have a question as to whether that's even racist. I mean, working to support local jobs for local people,
Mhm.
is who lives in that locale. Are you actually effectively, are you being racist, or are you being realistic about how your population are employed and how they are overlooked and how they are treated and respect? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I guess somebody from maybe a different group may argue differently, but I'm just like, is that racist?
Right.
It's a
So
tiny little
I'm
island, and
yes, and I'm being very simplistic in my approach towards what was happening, and I'm
mm,
doing so deliberately
mhm.
because I want to conjure up the concepts of what happens in Britain with Brexit.
Okay.
And what happens with Britain and Brexit and the idea of these foreigners coming in and taking our jobs and how it's associated with race when actually Britain needs the immigrants. Bermuda doesn't actually need immigrants. There's more than enough people there to fill the jobs, right?
Mm, 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 mm.
But actually, I'm making it simplistic because I want to convey and I want people to make those sort of links between race and
Mhm,
um, how you can be prejudiced and how often, many times, the sentiments linked with "we don't want foreigners here" is actually based on racial grounds. When
Mm-hmm.
the reality is Bermuda actually has too many people. The UK doesn't, but that's a whole different argument that I'm not trying to get into right now.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, as I said, the link with Brexit, it did give me that vibe that you were sort of alluding to, a Brexit idea that we don't need anybody extra because we have enough people here to do the jobs, when the unemployment statistics are so low that your situation is not borne out. And then when, of course, you stop people from coming, now crops are dying in the field, things are not getting done in your country because you don't actually have the workforce to do the jobs. And again, the statistics for unemployment are actually very low. And how you count unemployment, of course, is always a challenge. But it's interesting when I talk about local people, I'm thinking of, situations where you have a group of people who are being unfairly, I would say, discriminated against, and then they say, well, okay, but we're just going to employ our people in our space because obviously you don't like us, and you coming in here to dictate prices and tell us what to do.
So,
again, it seems crazy. So it's an interesting.
right.
Yes. Anyway, let me let you continue.
So no, well, I mean, in the example you bring up of Jordan Peele, I think what people are actually trying to do is discredit his position, because essentially what you're dealing with is a person of color who is gaining too much influence, too much wealth, and too much power, telling stories for Black people and telling stories for Black people, with Black people, and by Black people. And I say this because no matter what country you go to in the world, people within a community will tell stories for their own community. If you go to Japan, the actors are Japanese, the story writers are Japanese, the lighting people are Japanese. And nobody is saying to Japanese people, hey, you know what? You're telling stories for Japanese people, by Japanese people, with Japanese people. Therefore, you're racist. At the same time, when they incorporate a white person into their story, nobody's questioning whether they are truly Japanese or not. So then the question arises, when we're dealing with a Black person in the same situation who says, wait there, I'm actually telling stories for my community. Why then more importantly, with the Japanese people, you could incorporate a white person into a Japanese movie. That's a actual impact on the art form, on the story. But nobody's questioning whether the movie's Japanese or not, right? Jordan Peele just happens to be with somebody who doesn't present as Black. That's his personal life, and yet you're questioning his art form based on his personal life. That doesn't make sense.
No.
And yet, somebody like Quentin Tarantino, right, is portrayed as telling Black stories whilst he's a white man. Somebody make that make sense. Yep. And so when you look at these situations and these scenarios, you have to ask yourself, what is actually happening here?
I mean, it makes me think of one of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison. There is a clip, because it's Black History Month in the USA, that's making its usual rounds, as it does every year, I think, during Black History Month, in which Toni Morrison is being interviewed in Australia, I believe it is, and the interviewer is asking her why she doesn't incorporate white people into her stories. And she said, there are white people in my stories. And she said, and the interviewer says, yes, but not in any, as you know, any consequence. Won't you write for have a main white lead? And Toni Morrison says, I am not writing for white people. I'm not writing for the white gaze. I am writing for my people. This is my art form, and this is for my people. And therefore, you can be a marginal player. It's not like you don't exist in the world, but that's not the central characters that I'm looking at and establishing. And I will not do it either. And the interviewer comes back, and Toni Morrison says, do you understand that what you are doing in this interview is actually white supremacy? It's racism, because you would never question a white author and say, well, aren't you going to have lead characters from other races? Aren't you going to have a lead Black person? When are you going to write for a Nigerian? When are you going to write your main character as? You wouldn't even occur to you. But when faced with a Black author, your first immediate thing is to say, what about me? And why am I not central to the character? And I think that when we look at this idea of, can Black people be racist, to bring it back to that question, even in the setup to the question, there is an inherent white supremacist idea. You are literally coming from a place of privilege and imposing your will, as you've rightly said, on the other, and saying, well, you have to have us in, and we have to be the center of your story. Well, that doesn't make sense. When you're writing your story, you be the center. When we're writing our stories, we'll be the center. Like, why would I make you the center of this story? This doesn't make sense in its context or its time. So, yeah.
Right. So I just want to take that a step further and actually ask a question for anyone who watches this regarding a concept and saying, well, you know, it's racist for Black people to tell stories in which white characters aren't central to the idea. If you actually believe that, and I'm being sincere here, if you genuinely believe that, then I must ask a question of you. How then do you view the history curriculums taught in schools in which there are no Black characters that are central to the history of your nation? Because when we're telling the story of a nation, Black people are central to the stories of many, many, many European nations. They're central to the story of the USA. And yet, the only stories you will hear surround the narrative of slavery. You don't hear about the fact that actually, you know what? They were musicians, they were playwrights, they were engineers, they were all of these things. You know,
their land held all of the resources, and that we took that from them.
Right? Yes.
You don't hear about the kings and queens that you had to negotiate with to get your wealth, huh? Right? Otherwise known as overrun.
You know, so you know, it's like I believe it's Alexander Pushkin, who's known as the author of modern Russian literature.
Okay.
Is actually Black. Right? You know,
new information for me. It's always
right. So, you know, but you know, when you start looking into the history of these countries, you know, I believe his grandfather was, I forgot what his name was, something Gannibal, and he named himself after Hannibal. His grandfather was actually Black, and you know, it's all of these things. You know, but even, you know, let's move it away from Black people. You don't speak about the native peoples that, as you say, that were in the lands that had their own storytellers, their own arts, their own literatures, their own engineers, their own, all of these things. And these people are not made central to your stories. They are simply bit parts that must be conquered or overcome or moved out of the way in order that your protagonist in your history, can succeed, and it's also interesting that you're never the villain in your history. You're always the hero. So if you actually want to have a conversation about these stories and say, well, actually, why aren't I central in your story? Well, how about you start making others central to your story? And by your story, I mean history.
Yeah. Yeah. Can't really argue with that. Yeah, I think the idea of how we even get to the conversations about history is quite, I mean, it's an interesting topic, because I was even thinking about the eradication of different populations in order to serve a white supremacist idea. So as you were talking, one of the things that struck me is, having grown up in the UK, having been subjected to a British system, education system, what we learn in history is broad sweeping narratives about effectively white people. So you learn about the French, you learn about the Russian history, you learn about the World War between those nations. What you don't often learn about, which I think is really interesting, is even how, let's say, Britain came together, and the Romans and the Saxons and the people, that these different groups of people, not white people, but actual groups of people who have migrated, who have moved, who have conquered, you don't actually hear how those people developed in any way. And then we came to a place where white people existed. What you have is the Romans came and they did this, and now we have white people. And now we're all white and we're all happy. So you eradicate, actually, in order to achieve a goal, which is this white supremacist idea that white is right, you actually eradicate and strip the people, the white people, of their own identity. Like, they don't get to identify with any of their back history of difference and question any of these identities that they would have, due to the fact that it's mixed people, particularly in a place like the UK, where it's an island, and people came to the island and conquered the island several times, and there were wars between different fractions of people that live there. You just don't even consider, in the pursuit of saying white people, you kind of just tarnish them all with this, they were all white and now we are all white, and that's what it is. You don't even unpack some of those things to keep the identity of the people. And so it was quite striking when you were talking about even including Black people. I was like, well, first, they don't even tell their own history properly. They don't even really unpack these ideas. It's just, there were some white people and there were some other white people, and the white people fought and these white people won. And then guess what? Now we're all white people.
Well, I just want to say this. The reason they can't tell their own history is because you just said that there were white people and then there were white people, and now we're all white people. No,
that's not true. No, that's not how it was.
If they actually told their history accurately, you would have to make Black people central to the story. You're talking about the UK, for example. David Olusoga, his book, Black and British, in which he details the history of Black people within Britain. And he dates it to going back to pre-Roman era, essentially. But I'm sorry, but most white British people aren't ready to hear that actually some of the earliest known inhabitants of your country were actually Black. And I say your country very loosely because, well, yeah. So, You
You're
also have
typing
like
quickly.
what's that?
I said you're typing very quickly.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so as I said, I mean, anyone who hasn't read David Olusoga's book, I recommend it.
Mhm.
But you go to the British Museum, and when you enter the British Museum, you're met by this big bust, marble bust of the Roman Emperor Lucius Septimus.
Mhm.
Right? And when you look at this bust, it's now all white. Okay, but it is actually the bust of the North African Roman Caesar, who went and essentially conquered Britain. Britain was in revolt, and he
Mhm.
went to Britain and he suppressed
The
the
revolt.
revolt. Right? He is actually responsible for building the walls of the Square Mile in London.
Okay, I remember that bit of history. Didn't know it was a black person. Very interesting. Always
Right?
fun to learn something new.
Okay, but we're talking about an African man here.
Mm.
But you go into the British Museum and you look at the bust now, and it's all white. And the
Mm.
assumption that people make, because they say Roman emperor, is that he must have been white. But if you
Yes.
actually told the history, then actually you have to include Black people and Africans and make them central to
Mm.
European history.
Mm. Mm. And thereby in some ways dismantling, and I think this is why education for me is such an important factor. You dismantle ideas surrounding black and white, you know, that binary of saying things are black or white, and you fit into those categories. When you have to start tracing actual history and saying, okay, well, this was from North Africa, it was from this particular country, this particular region, look at this, you begin to go, well, if he was from there and he was Roman, and this one's from there and they are Saxon, and this one is from there and they're this, and they're all these different things, what are we talking about? What is this nonsense that we're talking about this purity of this black and white binary, when we know that that just does not exist? These are people groups, and this is how people moved and operated at those times. And actually, isn't that a fairer reflection of what we should be talking about now, as opposed to this, well, you're either this extreme or you're that extreme, and if you're in the middle, you're basically that extreme, but we're going to pretend like we like you more than them in order to give you some privileges, where really we don't like you at all either. You know, it's that you lose the control of a binary when you can say, actually, these are from this area and this area, this area. And I don't mean the whitewashing of Egyptians, which is exhausting. But I do mean the actual unpacking of who people actually are, and not this binary of black or white. Like, that's it. That's all we've got on the table. Once that came into existence with the addition of slavery and all of that, then it limited the way that we think about people in such a huge way, I think. So, yeah, I think telling the actual history helps to unpack this idea, which is also why I would say I've always resisted the temptation to say that black people are racist, because we don't have control of the definition of what black people is
Absolutely.
and are, and we don't have a control of the definition of what white people are. We try to control our own identity, but we're doing it within a white supremacist idea. And so therefore what we do is we label me passing, we label you light skin, and thereby from the black community's perspective, you're not really black, because even though you're black, you're not black. And then we have black, and we try to control that narrative, but then in the end this is not working, because our people, we don't come in one bottle and one shader,
Right.
so it becomes problematic.
As I said, it goes back to something I've said on the show before, is that
Mm.
I'm only as black, and any black person is only as black as the white person standing in the room determines them to be. Right? And so we've had this conversation about not being able to define black for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually want to go back to the concept of the idea that black people are racist within the confines and constructs of white supremacy. And so black people are racist, but only to do so and to further the cause and aims of white supremacy.
So we can use the illustration that you gave in the or I gave in the beginning that you jumped on, which is, for example, the Black Police Association. Now you called them overseers, huh? You used a term, and I thought this might come up again, so I might be able to use it now. The idea of the black overseer is the one who has been so manipulated, bullied, blah, 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 blah. Their identity has been so stripped that in the end, they will oversee their people and keep them in line, sometimes more harshly than their white counterparts, because of their supremacist ideas that have been baked into their system. And so you can have this situation where those stereotypes, very real humans, but those stereotypes come into play, where you find that there are Black people who have been given power or have a limited amount of power or what have you, and they use it in a way that is destructive to their own community, but it furthers the cause of white supremacy. And so thought that might come in handy as you were talking about the situation of
It's good because we're on the same wavelength, because I was going to bring it up and say, well, actually,
thought it was very handy. I was like, you know what, I'm going to leave that one right there. I may disagree with your interpretation, but I think it was handy to let it stand, to give it the idea of what you're talking about, which is this furthering of, and I think that is a true idea. Like I do agree with you that there is this narrative that one of the fundamental things is that Black people can be racist in so much as they can defeat their own purposes. Of course, you want freedom and you want freedom for your people, but in the end, what you're working towards is only serving a white supremacist system that continues to further entrench that. And we see that with very famous people, Candace Owens and these very famous Black people who just seem to shoot their own self in the foot constantly.
Yeah, you see, when you talk about Candace Owens and when you talk about the Black Police Association, I actually don't think they actually want freedom. I think what they want is power. Yes. And let's not mistake and equate the two as being one and the same, right?
But that is baked within the system of white supremacy. Like they've so bought into the idea of the white supremacist system of power that that's what they're after. When in fact, serves your purpose better is freedom.
Right. So what they want is they want a seat at master's table. That's essentially what we're dealing with. And I know we disagree on the Black Police Association, but the reality is, listen, any of them could have just said, yo, cousin, what's the deal with you and the police? How are you finding us? How are you doing this? And their family's going to tell them exactly what's going on. Right. So, as I said, the idea that they don't know, or this is incredulous, or this only serves to feed the system of white supremacy. It only serves to undermine the position, because how is it we can have all these Black police officers and now they're all shocked by what's happening?
Well, I don't think that they're all shocked. I think that's number one.
No, they're not shocked, but they're saying they're shocked.
The president said he was shocked by the figures,
and he represents the organization.
He does represent, but he said it goes to prove that there is bias within the policing. So he's surprised because, of course, the figures, and this is why I slightly disagree with you, of course, because the figures that are being trotted out all the time suggest otherwise. They are actually doctored figures. They are suppressed figures in order to prove the point that white people die, Black people die, Asian people die, other people die. They die, right? I mean, it's a side effect of policing, is that people die at the hands of police. I don't agree with that as a thing. I think that's just wrong, and it should be almost eradicated. How is that a thing? Like, what are we talking about here? Like, people die at the hands of police when in custody. Custody, that assumes that you already have the power. How you died in custody? What on earth is going on? So I have some problems with the whole concept. But if what you are being fed is that lie consistently, and that is what the report said, and you know that there is bias, then you would be surprised to hear that someone did an independent research, because there's been one a few years ago. We discussed it here, that report that came out in which it was a complete whitewash. All of the Black professors, everybody that was asked to participate in it, was so horrified by what was actually released by Boris Johnson's government that I forget what the paper was called, that they were just like, this can't be real. But these figures are constantly trotted out in every meeting you go to, in every place that you're saying this isn't, you're challenging these ideas, but you're getting back this information. When the full information comes to you, you would be like, damn, like, I'm surprised. Right. Like, I mean, I'm not surprised, but I'm surprised. And your immediate response is, I'm surprised. And it goes to prove that there is bias. Finally.
But I'm not surprised. As I said at the top of the program, you have access to more information than I do. I'm not a professional researcher. I don't have people on my staff I can go and say, hey, go find out this information for me. And yet all the statistics that I find show that Black people are more than 2 times likely. The fact that this paper has come out and says it's 7, okay, I'm actually not surprised by that. You know, the fact that the figures that I have are underinflated, I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah, but I also think that that's a use of language that maybe that I would say, I would say, I'm surprised. It goes to prove blah, 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 blah. But that doesn't mean that, like, I'm shocked. Oh my gosh, like, it's unreasonable to expect. And maybe that's a use of language thing. But anyway, the point is not to argue semantics over the Black British policing, blah, blah, blah commission. The point is to prove or to discuss the point of, can Black people be racist, right, and having the kind of overseer or the power hungry or the conversations about oh my gosh, prejudice, colorism, thank you, colorism within our systems, which keep certain colors higher, shades are, you know, more powerful, and people keep gravitating and grabbing for power, following the model of the white supremacist system, which says that power is the most important thing, when many communities around the world don't hold that value.
Right. And what I also want to do, as I said, come back to this concept of the fact that Black people are racist, but only so much as it is possible to serve the system of white supremacy. What you find is that in what occurs within Black empowerment, the narrative is often changed to support that of white supremacy. So we talk about the Jordan Peele, you know, we talk about what's it called? Affirmative action in the US, right? We talk about all of these things. The narrative now around it becomes one of that actually supports white supremacy, because people who already hold the power, who are already privileged, turn around and say, well, you're doing to us what we did to you, right? And of course, they should know they're the experts on it, right? Now, here's the thing. You're not actually doing the same thing to them. You're actually righting the injustices that they have historically perpetuated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in doing so, what it does is it allows this narrative to be built.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so when I say that Black people are racist and whatever you do only supports the system the system will always work to correct itself. So even where you fight for rights, the rights that you get under white supremacy, or that Black people have achieved under white supremacy, ultimately works to support white supremacy, right? No person, no authoritarian is going to give to people powers that will ultimately bring down them. And so you have to understand, whatever rights were bestowed, one, can be taken away, but two, are not ultimately designed to work for your benefit, right? So let's look at what's happening at affirmative action, right? The legislation that is being used to dismantle it in the US is actually the Equal Rights Act, right? Because the system of white supremacy will always seek to work to correct itself. So the legislation that was put in place and the programs that were designed to put in place to correct the historical wrongs is being destroyed by the legislation that was put in place to correct historical wrongs.
You can't make this stuff up.
No, that's some real irony there. You know,
you just can't make it up. Welcome to the dark side.
Right. But I think it's the clearest example you can give of just how, of what I mean by the system always works to correct itself.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's an interesting one. And I think that what we're trying to establish, I guess, in the various different guises is that when we talk about racism, let's put this into another context. Can a woman be sexist? Can a Jewish person be anti-Semitic? Can these categories, can a homosexual be homophobic? Can blah, 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 blah. Only as much as the system allows them enough power to shoot themselves in the foot, so to speak, right? So it's never a case of reverse, which is often what somebody is trying to claim when they ask the question. When people ask the question.
Yeah, I just want to interject and say, slight correction. It's not so much as the system allows a person to shoot themselves in the foot. It's so much as the system allows you to shoot other people like you in the foot. Because people like Candace Owens, who work to support the system, will get elevated. They will get special privileges. They will get all of these things, right? As long as they keep shooting other people in the foot.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Very good correction. And I think that when we're talking about this, when we're talking about this kind of systemic issue, I think it really is quite a naive position to hold in some ways, that, well, Black people can be racist too. You don't like, you have your issues with me as a white person. And it's like, well, okay, we can be prejudiced for sure, for absolute sure. Every group can be prejudiced, and every group can have their own xenophobic tendencies. So when we talk about xenophobic countries, there are places on earth where people just don't like outsiders, full stop. Doesn't matter what background, color, complexion, whether you're even associated, we don't like people that are not from here. And I have worked in regions of Europe in which they just don't like people from outside their city. They are the height of xenophobic. Like, we don't accept people who are from the same nation as us. And you want to come into our city, live, work, and marry our people and have children in this city? No, we don't like you. We don't accept you. And unto the third and fourth generations, these people are xenophobic. They have this outsiders are not right. But when we're talking about racism, particularly when we're talking about racism within the social construct of white supremacy, which is a world dominating social construct in which one group of people have put themselves at the top at the expense of everyone else, can a person in those other categories be racist against the people at the top of the pile? The question has to be, the answer has to be, obviously, we can be prejudiced, we can have our reservations, we can have some challenges. What we're not able to do at this current moment is change the entire system to make it so that you go through what we've been through, because that's what you're asking.
I actually want to ask a question.
Okay.
Is it prejudice or is it self-preservation? And I ask this because prejudice would mean to prejudge. Okay. And yes, to some degree, you prejudge a person because you don't treat them as an individual. Okay. But that's like, how can I put this? Growing up, it was the white teachers that would tell me I wasn't smart at school. Right? When I go for a job, it's a white boss usually who would deny me the job, although I'm the better skilled person. Right? It's white police officers that stop me on the street for no reason. Right? It's white police officers that refuse to take my complaints seriously. There's a consistent pattern, an identifiable characteristic that would make me reticent, right, to have interactions. And you might say that is prejudging, and I'm saying, or I'm asking, is that not based on a historical pattern of behaviors, right? Whereas quite often what we're talking about with white supremacy and the prejudice that comes along with that is that actually in many instances the white people that we're referring to may know one black person if they're lucky, maybe two.
They know the one they're asking
the somehow and these people haven't been able to have an impact on their life, right? But somehow you have a negative outlook on an entire race. But what happens when actually people are able to have a consistently negative impact or consistently cause negative outcomes in your life and all have an identifiable characteristic, you know, that you say, actually, I'm not sure. Now you can say, yes, you've prejudged them as an individual, but actually you could also argue, I have grounds to be wary. Whereas quite often it isn't the other case. It isn't the case the other way around. There's a documentary that was done a number of years ago in the US called The Color of Fear. And if you haven't seen it, I think it's really worthwhile watching. In which actually this concept is in some partly explored. And where actually some of the people admit to actually, and they're confronted by a black guy who says, wait there, I have to walk in your spaces. I have to live in your spaces. I have to adapt to your space. When do you ever adapt to mine? And the realization and coming to terms with actually these white people saying, actually, we don't actually ever have to do that. You know? So once again, is it prejudice that black people have? Or is it actually protective behaviors based on a pattern of history?
Well, I think I used the simplistic way, as you did illustrated earlier, to make a point, which is that when we're talking about prejudices that we may hold, whatever that may be, based on our, and oftentimes they're based on either social conditioning or your experience. They're based on something. The prejudice is held because of a reason. You may not be overtly aware of what that reason is. Maybe you are. And I've talked before on this show about how I used to have a real prejudice against skinheads. So white guys with skinheads. That's what we call them. I'm sorry. They've got shaved heads. And they would cause me to be filled with fear. I would have an anxiety. I could feel my adrenaline, and I could feel that tension as soon as I would see a group of guys. They looked a certain way, they had certain clothes on, they carried their hair a certain kind of way, and I would feel like, where is the nearest exit? Let me get out of here. This does not make me feel comfortable. And the historical reasons for those, of course, is that we had groups within the UK who used to march outside my front door, who wore the fatigues, had the skinheads, they had this attitude, and that, so you can have a prejudice. And it took me a while for me to figure out it was happening. Like it didn't occur to me immediately. But I eventually got to the point where I was like, why every time someone who looks like this comes around, do I have the same reaction? That's really unusual. Why am I doing that? What is the reason I'm having that reaction? And of course I realized it's a historical reason. A lot of times your prejudice can be something, just a story that's been told to you. You know, you've got it handed down generation after generation. Those people, who look like that came here and did this, therefore we have a prejudice. So I think
you
don't like my definition of prejudice.
No, what I want to see, but this is where I'm going to say it doesn't make sense to me, right? So we're talking about prejudice in this context, and people that have historically done wrong and the stories that are passed down, right? Then explain to me, okay, how it is that, let's take the British, for example. I know it might feel to some of the British viewers, look, this is pick on the British day, but let's take the British viewers, for example.
Normally it's pick on the Americans, so they're just getting their turn, huh?
Yeah, that's true enough. How it is that they are more welcoming of Germans in their country than they are of people who are melanated. Now, you're talking about people that have historically done wrong to them. They still talk about the Blitz and the war and defeating the crowds and all of this. Yet they were more willing to open the doors to people that they say, hey, these are the stories that are handed down of trauma, generational wrongs. But people that actually haven't done anything to you are the ones you don't want. So when you're talking about, the prejudice and it's the handing down of stories and you don't know why, well, actually, that kind of doesn't make sense to me.
The official definition, so that we got it. It doesn't have to make sense, because prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on a reason, reason or actual experience. So it's this handing down of a story or a narrative, or these ideas that you may formulate surrounding a group. It's not based on reason. It's not rational. It's not, I mean, in my case, reasonable and rational, one could argue. There's another one which says,
the question I'm asking is, you're saying that prejudice is based on, or it can be built on these historical stories of wrongs, of that people that look like this did this. Well, you know what the people that bombed your country look like, but you're perfectly fine with people like them coming into your country.
Because we have more in common with those people than we have with other people, because those people bombed our country because they don't like the same people that we don't like. Mistake. All is forgiven. But the people that fought them, Black Americans, West Indians, Gurkhas, Indonesians, Filipinos, all of those people who came and fought because their countries were colonized and came and fought the wars, Indians, Pakistanis, the list is endless of people from throughout the diaspora of the melanated, as we say, the world majority cultures who came and fought in world wars to stop this. Yeah, but those are still the people that are on the list of people that should be oppressed. that narrative is stronger than any other narrative because I want to stay at the top of the pile. And so while a German can repent of their sins and move on, the person who never did anything and in fact fought in your wars is still on the receiving end of some of the worst treatment. If we talk about the Gurkhas, for example, still on the receiving end of some of the worst treatment, because in the end, the idea that is strongest is not the war. The idea that is strongest is that white is right.
Right. So then, and I think this is ultimately the question that I want to ask is, then does this not then remove the concept of unconscious bias?
Well, that's an
Because
argument that
you have to cognitively, in some level, process this information to say, actually, what's important to me. You have to determine this value of what is important to me is not the generational wrongs, but actually the maintenance of the systems of power.
But that is a discussion that's happening now within academic circles, at least. One that I'm following slightly, which is unconscious bias actually unconscious? So, you know, this idea that we've put forward, and again, the reason that the conversation is happening is rather interesting, because the reason that the conversation is happening is something that you said earlier, which is that when faced with the challenge of dealing with a system that might correct itself. So when we're talking about anti-racism education, beginning to turn the tide of how particularly white people were feeling about racism, and were beginning to identify themselves not as white but as Irish and as Italian, and beginning to go, actually, we need to extricate ourselves from this system of oppression. We need to elevate Black voices. We need to do this. The system, correcting itself, said, well, it's unconscious bias. I didn't mean it. Like, oh, and we discussed this on the show a few weeks ago with the Football Association's kind of case of, we didn't mean it. Well, you blatantly waited till Black people were in the room to start using names in an offensive way, or the Asians were in the room, so you started using these. You are doing it consciously. This isn't unconscious. And so the very system that of language that was developed to help us to identify behaviors such as unconscious bias is now being hijacked in what we discussed before to say, well, actually, now we're having to dismantle that system and say, well, okay, this doesn't work because you really are conscious of your racism. And so, okay, conscious racism. But when we go back to conscious racism, all of you cry foul and fall on the floor and pretend like you don't know what we're talking about. So what are we? And it detracts from the actual anti-racism education, because we're spending so much time over what kind of language we can use that you don't get to do the thing that you're meant to do, which is educate the people and dismantle the system. And so it's an interesting conversation that is actually taking part at the moment, which says that actually, although we've been talking about unconscious bias because people hold biases that you have since you're a child, things that you have an aversion for that you may not consciously remember why, because we have biases from childhood. You've learned behaviors that have been imparted upon you that you may not remember, reactions of your parents. You know, if you saw your mother clutching a bag every time a Black person came around, you would clutch a bag every time a Black person. You may not consciously know why you do it. You have nobody told you to clutch your bag. That's just your auto. I saw my mom do it. I clutch my bag. That's what I do. This happens. XYZ. It's an unconscious thing, becomes a conscious bias, because when we started using the language of unconscious bias, y'all went crazy down a road that really we were not talking about that sort of behavior. So now we have to dismantle the idea of unconscious bias, not because I think fundamentally isn't unconscious bias, but I think because it's been taken to such an extreme due to the system, as you said, correcting itself, that now we have to eradicate it. When we talk about unconscious bias, you're talking about small acts of things that you do without even thinking about it. Everybody can think of something. There was a famous story of the woman who would cut the ends of the chicken off, because her mother always cut the ends of the chicken off when she did the pan. And then when finally one day she was like, why am I cutting the ends? Like it took 30 something years or 40 something years. And she was like, why do I do this? And she asked her mum, because she just found herself doing it one day and was like, this doesn't make sense. What am I doing? And the mother said, oh, because I always had a small pan. We never had a pan big enough. I don't know why you do it. 40 years of wasted chicken. Like, what can you say? It was an unconscious action that when it finally became conscious, she was like, hold on, what am I doing? There are unconscious biases that we can have, immediate reactions to things. But the problem is, and herein lies the challenge, when you're trying to discuss that with white people who are white supremacists and refuse to accept that they themselves are baked in a racist system, and therefore, unfortunately, you need to deconstruct that baking and sort it out, the system will correct itself and will refuse the language and will make it so that the language becomes ridiculous. The guy who's shouting the N-words and what was he manipulating Arnold Schwarzenegger's name so that it was a racial slur? He's clearly not using unconscious bias. He's made an option. He made a choice to choose violence that day. That is a choice. That's not what we're talking about. But because of that, the whole apple cart falls out. Anyway, that was my little rant and rave for the day. Thank you. Thank you and welcome to the dark side. I'm glad you're here. The question of the day is, can Black people be racist? And this is the discussion that we're in. Back to the original question that you were asking. Or back to the original answer I was asking. I don't even remember anymore. We've gone down a rabbit hole. Okay, so can Black people be racist?
Yes.
And who is their racism directed towards? Right? And no, because who is their racism directed towards? Is reverse racism a thing? No. Stop it. Please, you're making me tired. Yeah. Stop it. Just stop. You're doing too much. Do you know what I think? I think when white people ask the question of can Black people be racist, I think we have to ask the question, why are you asking that question? So what if they could? What is your point? What is the point? Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Black people could be racist against you as a white person. What's going to happen? What are you afraid of? What is it you're concerned about? Because we all know the Jane Elliott question that comes to a room full of white people. Who here would like to be treated the way white people treat Black people? Who here would like to be treated as a Black person? Silence. Just put up your hand if you don't mind taking the treatment of any Black person you know. Silence, because you all know that you're wrong. You all know it's a white supremacist system, but you're acting as if it's not. So yeah, my answer is yes, of course. But they're only shooting their own people in the foot. They're not actually doing anything to you. You get away with it scot-free. It's not happening to white people. It's only ever happening to the people who are on the receiving end. And when we talk about the corrective elements of anti-racism educators or Black creators, artists, authors who write Black content because those are their stories, they're their people, they're writing from their perspective, mind your business. Just really mind your business. If you don't like it, it's not for you. Just move on. Go find one of your 5 million trillion other white people that you could read their stuff. Go ahead. Go find that. We're okay over here. Leave us alone. Anyway. Okay. My little rant's over. You do something now. And then we'll end.
Listen, I'm good. I just have a lot of questions. Especially, like when we did the show the other week, where I said, yeah, I'm not sure about the idea of the concept of unconscious bias. I'm even more convinced that I don't agree with the concept of an unconscious bias. And I think the Jane Elliott question is a perfect one, because that requires actually you to process information, to cognitively process information and arrive at a conclusion. And if that's a conclusion you can arrive at, then actually you're consciously aware of what's happening.
Yeah. But then, as I said, I think unconscious bias has been stripped of its actual definition. And I think that's problematic because the system is just correcting itself. And I'm not saying, so that for me is an issue, but I agree with you because you just throw the term out the window. We still have the same problem, huh?
Yeah.
You know that y'all are racist to, like, the system, white gets better and black gets the worst. We all know that. And you can take any culture around the world, and if you're lighter and if you're darker, there is a disparity. Why? Because the white supremacist system has infiltrated society across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as I said, I think in terms of white people, black people, racism, I think the answer is yes and no. And as I said, there will be people out there saying, well, you can't have both. Yeah, actually, you can.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yes, yes, you can. All right, well, this has been The Dark Side. We are TC Storm and Tabitha Purple. We are your hosts here on The Dark Side. We are always happy to receive your questions. We are live every week at 9 o'clock Central European Time. We cover issues such as anti-racism work, feminist stuff, news, politics, you name it, anti-capitalist stuff quite a lot, anti-white supremacist stuff quite a lot, because we like to educate you on the alternative way of actually looking at what you've been looking at from the same perspective, and we like to just shift you over just a little bit so you can see our broader perspective, and that's The Dark Side. Please like, share, subscribe, do the thing. You have to say bye now.
Yeah, deuces.
Have a great evening, everyone, and we will, or day, depending on when you're watching this. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on The Dark Side. Bye-bye.